this lesson, we'll discuss the basics of creating a rhythm section in various styles with our new setup. In Western music, tunes popular in the United States and in Europe, a rhythm section typically consists of a bass or bass guitar and percussion such as a drum set, shakers, and other miscellaneous rhythm instruments. Before we get started, let's make sure we save our template from the last lesson in Logic Pro, which will enable us to start fresh at any time. To save our current project as a Logic Pro template, from the File menu, click on Save as Template. Provide a name for the template. I'll name mine Chiptune Course. Now, click Save in the bottom right corner of this dialog box and we're done. To demonstrate how to later recall this template, I'll close this current project and start a new one with our new template. Once the project is closed, I'll click on File, New from Template, which will open the New Project dialog. If you don't see your template here, on the left, make sure you've selected the directory where you're storing your current templates. Mine is entitled My Templates. Here, I'll select the template I just created and click on Choose to load my template. Voila, we're back in business. Now, I've uploaded the Logic Pro X template for this lesson on my website. There are some drum and bass MIDI loops I've written for the lesson, so you'll definitely want to grab the template. It's a free download and you can find the link in the description. Once you've downloaded the template, open it up in Logic and we'll begin. Now, getting back to our rhythm section discussion, let's listen to a few common Western rhythm section styles. Here is an example of a jazz rhythm section with a walking bass line. This is a style you'd likely recognize from Nintendo's Super Mario series, more specifically Super Mario Bros. 2 for the original Nintendo Entertainment System. In this loop example, I've written a simple walking bass line that primarily consists of diatonic scale notes being played on every beat with a few swinging eighth notes here and there. I won't get into too much music theory in here, but this pattern is based on a 2-5-1, the most common chord progression in jazz. This loop is in the key of C major, and the chords associated with the bass line are C, the 1, D minor, the 2, and G7, the 5 of C major. The most important thing to recognize is that most of the notes are played on quarter notes, which gives us an on-the-beat feel. The rhythm is constant and consistent. The overall sound truly gives us the feeling of a person leisurely walking along. Now, let's take a look at the drum set. Our drummer is playing a pretty relaxed pattern using three parts of the drum set: the bass drum, or kick, the snare drum, and the ride cymbal. This rhythmic pattern is based on groups of threes known as triplets. It's counted like this: 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This pattern is also swinging, which delays the last eighth note in the pattern. This makes it feel more hip. We can control the swing of each instrument by highlighting the notes we'd like to affect. Then, we'll go over here and change the swing level. Here is how it sounds straight. And then back to swing. The kick and snare can vary quite a bit here. Feel free to get creative with this pattern. The driving force of this beat is definitely the ride cymbal. The rhythm has to stay consistent in order for us to gain this feel. Notice that the ride cymbal is playing on every quarter note, just like our bass line. Let's hear them together. Let's set the cycle so we can loop this section over and over. We can either draw it manually up here by clicking and dragging, or we can automatically draw it by highlighting the region we'd like to loop over, then by pressing the Command and U keys together. In this example, I've written a retro-sounding bass line with a little swing to make it sound funky. Rock and funk are really closely related styles. The difference comes down to instrument choice and the introduction of swing and syncopation into the rhythm. The bass part is a pentatonic riff. It has a syncopated feel throughout, meaning that there is a lot of emphasis on the offbeat. You can hear this especially in the end section of the loop. Right here. Those notes are all on off beats. Here's how it sounds with just the beat. Now, let's focus our attention on the drum set. The drum set part may seem a little crazy if you've never written a drum part. It's really just a simple pattern with some fills. If we focus just on the opening bar, you'll see that we have three main components, just as we did with the jazz drum part: a kick, snare, and a hi-hat cymbal. The hi-hat cymbal could be replaced with the ride, just as it was in the jazz loop, and we'd still have the same type of effect. If we look closely at the pattern, the kick is playing on every beat, or every quarter note. We call these quarter notes because each note consumes 25% or 1/4 of the measure. In a rock-style beat, the emphasis of the kick is on beats 1 and 3. You can see that the kick notes on beats 1 and 3 are a little darker than those playing on beats 2 and 4, which means they have higher velocity. In the most basic rock beat, there is not a kick drum played on beats 2 and 4, but I prefer the fuller sound of the kick and snare playing together on beats 2 and 4. Here is how it sounds without the kick on 2 and 4. As I mentioned, the snare drum is playing on beats 2 and 4. Notice that these are also quarter notes. If we wanted to make this a little more funky, we could add a 16th note snare hit right before beat 3 of the measure. The hi-hats are playing on every 8th note. Just as with the quarter note, if we were to divide this measure into 8 equal sections, we're playing the hi-hat at the beginning of each section. The rest is just some fancy fills on top of that basic beat. Notice the toms toward the end of the loop. These are the drums that are typically mounted on the bass drum and on the floor to the right of the drummer. Keeping in mind our jazz and funk rock rhythm section examples, in order to recreate these loops in a chiptune style, we'll have to create the instruments first. So here's our list of instruments: bass, kick, snare, hi-hat, ride, and toms. Let's start with the bass. As we discussed in the last video, the waveform that most closely resembles a bass is the triangle wave. Let's copy our upright bass region over to our triangle channel by holding the Option key while clicking on the region and dragging it over. Now, before we play it, due to the multiple rhythmic examples I've created here, I had to set multiple tempos. So, I'd like to quickly show you how to control tempos in Logic Pro X. Click on the drawer icon located just above the track names in the Arrange window. Here, you should see the tempo drawer. If not, just right-click in this area and make sure the tempo option is checked. Now, you can set different sections of your song to carry different tempos by clicking and creating these sectioned lines here. You can even bend or curve the tempo over time. This is one way to set tempos, but unless I'm doing something crazy, I prefer to use the tempo drawer on the right. To get there, just click on the three-lined icon on the top right and select the tempo submenu. Here, you can precisely create tempo changes. If you use the left and right keys next to the M key on your keyboard, you can move the playhead left or right, one measure at a time. When you have it set to the point where you'd like to add a tempo change, click on the plus button here and type in your new tempo. As you can see, I've already drawn in some tempos. Now that we have that settled, let's take a listen to this loop. It sounds pretty good. Now, if you'd like it to sound a bit more bassy, we can drop the whole pattern by an octave. There are a couple ways to do this. 1. Double-click on the region to open it in the piano roll. Press the Command and A keys together to select all of the notes in this region. Then, while holding the Option and Shift keys, press the down arrow on your keyboard. This will manually drop the notes down an octave. Ah, yes, that's much more bassy. Now, I'll undo that and show you a different method. With this method, select the region and under the region options, transpose the region by -12 semitones or half notes. Both methods produce the same result, but I prefer the first method. There are a bunch of ways to create drum and percussion sounds with the magical 8-bit plug, but these are the methods I use. As we did with the jazz bass line, copy over the drum set region and place it on the first measure of the noise channel. Let's listen. Eek! That sounds horrible. One problem here is that our kick drum is really long and the note is too high in pitch to sound like a low hit. So let's drop the bass drum sound down a couple of octaves using the same method we discussed a few minutes ago. That's a little better, but now I'm noticing that the hi-hat cymbal sounds more like a snare. Perhaps we can raise that a couple octaves to make it sound a little higher in pitch, more like a cymbal. The real problem here is that the notes are simply too long. When you hit a drum, the resonance is typically pretty short and trails off quickly. So let's open the magical 8-bit synthesizer on the noise channel and tame the sound. If you've ever looked at a synthesizer, you'd notice that they have a bunch of dials and knobs. Each of these dials controls either the waveform type, the attack, decay, sustain level, release, or some other sound filter. So, adjusting one of these horizontal dials on the magical 8-bit synth is the same as turning one of these knobs on a hardware synthesizer, such as the Moog shown here. Let's briefly talk about how each of these dials affects the sound. The attack determines how fast a note will sound at full volume after the sound has begun. We can control the time it will take for a note to fade in down to the millisecond. I'll change the attack to 1 second, which will cause the note to start at a volume level of nothing or silence and reach full volume after it has been playing for 1 second. You can already hear how we might emulate a crowd cheering. If we turn the attack back down to 0, the sound will come on at full level instantaneously. Decay determines how long a note will take to fade to silence after the note is played. I'll lengthen the decay and reduce the sustain level momentarily so I can demonstrate the effect. The sustain level controls the volume level of the sound when it's being sustained. So, playing a note after the note has decayed, you can hear the sustain. As long as the note is held down, the sound will remain and never decay. Most of the time, I set this to 0. Release is the opposite of attack. The release determines how long it will take the note to fade to nothing after the key or note has been released. I'll set the release to 1 second just as I did originally with the attack. Notice that if I play this sound at a higher pitch, it's starting to sound like a ride cymbal. Here's the real ride for comparison. This sounds a bit better, but the release is so long that we're losing all of the rhythm. So in this case, we're going to forego the ride and replace it with a hi-hat. The hi-hat is a much shorter sound and will allow our rhythm to come through. To make our hi-hat, We'll just shorten the decay and release. Notice how shortening the decay and release has improved our entire drum part. I call this a noise drum kit. It's a single noise synth with one setting that mimics an entire drum set. It sounds great as a drum kit for a jazz style loop. It's very similar to something you'd hear in a Super Mario game. On the other hand, this may not work as well for a rock drum part. With that being said, let's take a look at our rock funk rhythm section loop. Let's copy our rock funk bass line over to our triangle channel. I'm going to set mine on measure 9, right where I have my tempo set at 92 beats per minute. Again, the bass line sounds great. We do have the option to drop it an octave, but I like it where it is. Now, let's grab our drums. That's not too bad actually with the same settings from our jazz loop. However, with this loop, I want to show you how you can get into some more detail with the drum set. Let's duplicate our noise channel a few times so we can isolate each part of the drum set. Use the Command and D keys to make quick work of it. Now, let's duplicate our loop region onto each track. We'll also rename each of our tracks according to a part of the drum set. We'll start with the hi-hat. Mute all of the drum set regions with the exception of the one on the hi-hat channel. Just select them and press the M key to mute them. I'll mute the bass for now as well. Now, double-click on the soloed region to open it in the piano roll. We'll zoom the viewport so that we can see all of the notes. Now, we want to isolate the hi-hat cymbal, which is played on note F#1. So highlight all of the notes that are not on F#1 and delete them by pressing the delete key on your keyboard. Don't worry, we have several copies of the entire drum part. Now, let's take a listen. Again, this sounds more like a snare drum than a hi-hat, so let's raise the pitch a few octaves. We'll also make a few adjustments to the attack, decay, and release. That sounds better. Now, let's look at the snare drum. Unmute the snare region and delete all of the notes except for the snare, which is played on notes D3 and E3. That sounds pretty good, but I'd like the snare to be a bit more beefy. Let's lower the pitch a bit and mess with the settings. Better. Now, the kick. Unmute the kick region and delete all of the notes that are not played on C1. Let's drop the kick a couple of octaves to get a bassier sound. That's better, but I think we can do a lot more with this. One way to get a beefier kick drum is to use a square or triangle wave. One effect that will really put this over the top would be to add a quick pitch drop at the beginning of each note. To achieve this effect, we'll add a negative sweep to the synth. Let's increase the pitch of our kick drum a few octaves so that it's 1 octave higher than where we started. Now, select negative under the sweep switch control. Not much of a difference yet, but if we lengthen the decay, the effect will be much more obvious. Let's shorten the sweep time dramatically so that it's almost instantaneous. Let's also reduce our decay. Ah, yes. That sound is much more like a kick drum. I know this sounds so much better than the noise kick, but we need to remember one thing when we employ this method. By using the triangle wave, we removed one of our melody creating waves, more specifically the one we used for the bass. With this method, we can only play the bass drum when the bass guitar is not playing. Let's hear it with the bass. Select both the bass and kick drum regions by holding Shift while selecting them. Then, double-click on one of the regions to open them in the piano roll. Here you can see where the notes overlap. You can see how we might be able to get away with this. Alternatively, we may be able to use a square wave. But that may create some issues with the melody or harmony. Lastly, we could use a DPCM sample for the kick. We'll discuss this in more detail later. For now, let's leave this as it is. We still have a few more drum set components to create. Toms are very similar in structure to the bass drum. Usually, bass drums are stuffed with a pillow or other padding to reduce the resonance after the kick drum mallet strikes the head of the drum. Conversely, toms are typically allowed to ring out or sustain without any hindrance. To create our toms, we'll need to apply the same technique we did to create the bass drum. However, we'll just need a longer decay to mimic the free decay on a tom. Unmute the region on the toms channel. Open the region in the piano roll and delete all of the notes that are not A1, B1, C1, or D2. You should be left with only a few fill notes. Now, let's copy our kick drum settings over to our tom instrument. It sounds too muffled for toms, so let's lengthen the sweep time, decay, and release a bit. We could also raise the toms an octave to make it sound a bit more gamey. Now, just as with the bass and kick drum, we're now using the triangle wave for toms as well. So let's at least get rid of the kick notes that are taking place when the toms hit. That's better and more in line with our limitations. Now, let's make a crash cymbal and we're done. Unmute the crash cymbal region and open it in the piano roll. Delete all of the notes that are not played on C#2. There should only be one crash cymbal in this region. The crash cymbal has a sharp attack with a long decay. Let's mess with our decay and release a bit to get this to sound more like a crash cymbal. That sounds better. Let's also raise the pitch a few octaves. We can even add a negative sweep to this to allow it to have a more natural sounding decay. Now, let's play the whole kit with our bass line. If we compare it to the original, it's not a bad rendition. Okay, that's it for this lesson. Once you've gone over this lesson in detail, I challenge you to create something original with these ideas. Write a new bass line, or mess with some of the settings to create some harder drums. Be creative. When you've locked in these ideas and you're ready to move on, I'll see you in the next video.